Dear Chain, hopefully this mana, construct, and egg find you well. Sincerely, Urza. What is wrong with that guy?
Hello friendos, this is Shane, welcoming you back to Chain of Commander, and it is time for our monthly visit to the base of operations, where we talk about ways to make your mana base work harder for you. And just in time for this month's episode, we were dropped one of the spiciest lands of all time in these early Modern Horizon 2 spoilers in Urza's Saga. Now before we get into this land, and there is a lot to unpack with this thing, if this seems like the kind of thing you want to build with, especially after this video, definitely consider using that TCG player affiliate link in the description below. Won't cost you a single cent more, but it will help out the channel. That said, let's get into this land, because like I said, we have a lot to unpack here. Alright, before we can take a look at what Urza's Saga does, I think it will behoove us to appreciate what Urza's Saga is.
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is.
Urza's Saga is an enchantment land, Urza's Saga. Let's take a look at those first two words there. Enchantment land. These are the card's super types. And this is the first card ever in a legal set to have this particular pairing of super types. The only other card that had this pairing on it prior was the test card Enchanted Prairie, and it says right on that, that's for playtest use only. So what does this mean as far as Urza's Saga is concerned? Well, that means this thing interacts with things that care about enchantments, and it also interacts with things that care about land. So let's say you have Selef, Beloved of the Sea, which protects your enchantments for you. Urza's Saga will be equally protected. Let's say somebody else has a Blood Moon out there, which makes all your non-basics mountains. Unfortunately, your Urza's Saga is going to be affected as well. But because it's an enchantment land in all zones, that means any cards that can interact with those type of lands or those type of cards in other zones can also interact with these. So if you have something like an Idyllic Tutor, which lets you tutor out an enchantment from your deck into your hand, you can grab Urza's Saga. Let's say you have a Crucible of Worlds in the field, which lets you play lands from the graveyard. You can play your Urza's Saga. Let's move over to the other two words, Urza's and Saga. So original. That first one, Urza's. This is the fifth card with the Urza's subtype. The previous four are the 3 Tron lands and Urza's Factory. From what I can tell, there are no cards that care about the Urza's subtype. It's just there for flavor reasons. However, that second subtype, Saga, makes this card historic. Now, it is not a spell. This is a historic permanent at best. And there are only 4 cards I could find that care about specifically historic permanents. And they're all from Dominaria, which makes sense since that's the only set that really cared about historic cards so far. But those 4 cards are Curator's Ward, which whenever the permanent leaves the battlefield, if it's enchanted with Curator's Ward, you get to draw 2 cards. Guardians of Kolios, when it enters the battlefield, you can return another historic permanent to your hand. Sentinel of the Pearl Trident, when it enters the battlefield, it can flicker a historic permanent. And lastly, you have Trident Temporal Gateway, which can just plop historic permanents onto the battlefield. So, not too many cards that really care about the fact that this is a historic permanent, but it doesn't change the fact that it is a historic permanent, and those 4 cards can interact with them in some pretty cool ways. Now, before we go on to what this card does, let's just have a quick reminder as to how sagas work. When a saga enters the battlefield, it enters with its first chapter counter, or I think they call them lore counters, the first lore counter on it, and triggers its first chapter. Then come around to the end of your next draw step, after your next draw step, so technically the beginning of main phase 1, you will then put on the next lore counter and trigger the appropriate chapter for the number of lore counters on it. And then, once the card has as many or greater than lore counters than chapters on the card, once whatever ability resolves, you will then sack the card as a state-based action. Now, before we actually go on to what this story that this card's telling us here, if you get any value out of this video at all, hit that like button to show it. I greatly appreciate it. But that said, let us listen to the tale this saga tells. Alright, sit right back and I am going to tell you a story about Urza Saga. Chapter 1. Urza Saga gains tap, add colorless. Well, that's just great. It means we can actually use this land to tap for mana, and it means we have function out of it as soon as it hits the battlefield. So that is definitely good to see, but really not too much depth to that particular ability. So let's move on to Chapter 2. Urza Saga gains 2 and tap. Create a 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token with this creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. Alright, now we're getting some meat on these bones. We have some choices. We can either choose to use this card for mana for the turn, or we can choose to create this construct token. Now, I would say in most situations, the more valuable play is to make the construct token. However, obviously, if you need the mana, you need the mana. No shame in using it for the mana. On to Chapter 3. Search your library for an artifact card with mana cost 0 or 1 and put it onto the battlefield. Then shuffle. Alright, this is an artifact tutor on a land, which makes it very difficult for your opponents to interact with this ability. However, Urza Saga will be sacked once that ability resolves. However, there is a very brief window between where Urza Saga's last ability gets put on the stack and where it resolves, where you can maintain priority and still use Urza Saga to either tap for mana or create another construct token. Make sure you don't forget that. You're losing out on a lot of value if you forget to do that before you end up resolving its tutor ability. And this tutor ability, it's kind of a weird one, because unlike most other similar abilities which care about converted mana cost, or what's now referred to as mana value, this ability does not. It cares explicitly about the mana cost. It needs to be mana cost 0 or 1, which means that the target needs to have that 0 or the 1 in the corner for it to be a valid target. For example, things that you can successfully get with Urza Saga. Lion's Eye Diamond, Soul Ring, Relic of Progenitus. Things you cannot get with Urza Saga. Mox Tantalite, it does not have a mana cost. The Artifact Lands also do not have a mana cost. Astral Cornucopia, its mana cost is XXX, not 0 or 1. Dispeller's Capsule, its mana cost is a single white, not 0 or 1. Now, whatever you do end up grabbing does instantly boost any construct tokens you have, and quite frequently you're going to end up getting a mana rock to substitute the mana you are losing for losing this land. So a Soul Ring, or if you're lucky enough, a Mana Crypt. But yeah, just be careful when fetching with this land, because it's very explicitly 0 or 1, not CMC less or mana value less. You gotta pay attention to those actual mana costs. Now the real question here, I think, is what decks want to see this card in them? And before we get to that, I do ask, you made it this far, definitely consider subscribing below. I'd love to have you folks join us going forward, and I'm sure you'll see some stuff that you might like. Yeah, let's move on. Alright, so like I was questioning, what are the decks that want to be running Urza Saga? Well, the first ones, the obvious ones that come to mind really, are artifact decks. Especially those that like to play cheap artifacts. So I'm thinking of things like Joyer, Weatherlight Captain, the new Osgear from Commander 21, or even Urza himself. So much flavor. These are all decks that quite often are playing a lot of really, really tiny artifacts, which means you have a lot of really, really tiny targets to grab with that last ability. And quite often you can then use these decks as kind of a bit more toolboxy with that last ability, where let's say you need to get some graveyard hate, you can go grab a Soul Guide Lantern. Or let's say you need to get some card draw, you can go grab a Skull Clamp. These decks will quite frequently have a variety of targets in them to grab with that last ability, and quite often they can meet whatever specific need you're looking for at that time. Now, this next deck that we're brought up, this actually stemmed from a conversation I had with the wonderful Mono Whiteboarder, who I recently did an interview with not too long ago. You should probably go check that out when you have the chance. But he pointed out on Twitter that because these are enchantment lands, and in fact it's our only enchantment land, this also can work in some Enchantress decks. Specifically, Enchantress decks that use a lot of constellation triggers. So things like Citizen Champion and things of the ilk. May like seeing a constellation trigger coming from the land spot. Now, I kind of got in a discussion with him on this one. Is the constellation trigger worth the single constellation trigger worth the fact that this land blows itself up in a couple turns in a vacuum? And I kind of shied away from that. I wasn't quite feeling it, but we did have a good discussion. We kind of think there are some good synergies, especially if you have multiple targets with this last ability, where the deck isn't too bad, especially if you're playing things like Citizen Champion, Eidolon of Blossoms. Once that land hits the battlefield, you'll instantly get another card off of it. And even at that point, even if it doesn't have a target, you still replaced it when you got it on the battlefield. But if it does have a target, now you're getting 2 for 1. And that's a pretty good return. So it could very well have a home in some Constellation-style builds. But as we got talking, it brought us to the next deck we're going to talk about here. Voltron Decks. That's right. I'm specifically thinking of Sigarda Hosted Hurons, the no-sack Sigarda. People like playing her as a Voltron commander because she's very difficult to get rid of. And because she's white and green, she also plays a lot of the Enchantress effects. So Citizen Champion, Mesa, Enchantress, which doesn't use the Constellation, but Eidolon of Blossoms, the Eidolon of Blossoms and Citizen Champions both have Constellation triggers to draw some cards, where having that land drop to trigger those Constellation draws is great. And then when the land explodes and goes get you an artifact, you can get an equipment that you can then attach to Sigarda as well. It also makes you some constructs that just get bigger the more equipment you play. So you'll have a nice big beady beefer that you can start hitting away at people with. It's definitely got a lot of synergy more in those style decks, but I'll be honest with you folks, there is one very particular deck. One that instantly came to my mind when I saw this card that I looked at. I'm like, this is the deck I'm going to put that in. And that is my Zozu the Punisher deck. Some of you might recall a little bit ago, I did a Zozu deck tech, and the deck hasn't really changed a lot since then. But you will know from that deck tech that Zozu is all about playing a bunch of low-costed mana rocks in order to then restrict actual land drops for the table without cutting myself off on mana. So having a land here that can make a creature token that I can start bopping people with, that can go get my mana rocks out of the deck, and also it plays Crucible of Worlds, so I can then bring it back and do it again and again and again. And there's even cards in my deck that care about me having lands in my graveyard. There is just so much next level synergy in that Zozu deck for Urza Saga that I am super pumped to try it out. So, what does this mean for us going forward? Well, Wizards has now essentially opened the proverbial floodgates. They are now saying that they are comfortable pairing enchantment and land as super types on the same card, which could, as we mentioned, start affecting a variety of strategies from artifact to enchantment to land-based strategies. Now, as with all other sagas, I have a feeling going forward, the playability of the particular saga, even if it is land, is more dependent on what it does than what it is. But I'm very, very interested to see what direction Wizards decides to, if any, go with this next. And at this point, I think I want to hear from you folks. I want to know what your initial reactions to Urza Saga with. Are you excited to play with it? What decks are you going to put it in? Do you think this is an affront to all things that Magic has been thus far? That might be a bit of an overreaction, but I'd love to hear it anyways down in the comments below, on my Discord, wherever you find me. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear it. Beyond that, thank you all for joining me today. This was a very cool card to talk about, and I'll see you guys again in the future.